Yeah, again, thanks for being flexible. I ran out of the house without my key and then was like, oh, no, I'm not going to be able to get into the office. But I made it and appreciate you coming on. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm wearing I almost fit this t-shirt that says solar.
I
It
like it.
dates from the 80s, and it's sort of my badge of honor of saying, I've been doing this thing since before you were born. Okay,
Yes.
that's enough ageism on my part.
Well, it was awesome getting to talk to you outside of this, and we just had such a great conversation. I kept trying to cut you off because I was like, I want to get this recorded so other people can hear all this awesome stuff. But let's get into your backstory a little bit. If you don't mind, start me from the beginning. How did you start to love construction and architecture and what give me the any version of it you'd like.
Um, as a precocious child, I was really good at taking things apart and not particularly good at putting them back together. But like I remember like taking apart radios, transistor radios, and looking at like all those components that were soldered together on what was then called a circuit board, right? Before there were integrated circuits, and being like astounded at the structure of that. And there's not too much of a leap from that to being concerned about the design of cities, sustainable design, et cetera, et cetera. Like as a kid reading my weekly reader at age 10, I read about the Montreal World Exposition, where the U.S. built this geodesic dome and that was designed by Buckminster Fuller. And before there was Wikipedia or an internet, like I had figured out who Buckminster Fuller was, that this polymath, he was kind of a mathematician, kind of a scientist, but he was also an architect. And he believed in this thing. He talked about design science and the ability of design science to make humanity 100% successful on spaceship Earth, this amazing Goldilocks condition planet that we're in, hurling through space at however many miles a second. 86,000 miles a second sort of comes to mind, but please, somebody should fact check me on that.
Got to be close enough, I think.
But the point being is that I actually got to hear this guy speak at age 14, and at age 16, and heard him again. And I remember both times he actually sat me down beside him during the book signing reception and just had me like pay attention to like how he interacted with his public, in the same way that you and I are interacting, right? But and he could like recognize that, like, form of a 14 and 16-year-old kid, he had found someone who understood what integrated life support system design was for spaceship Earth. Okay, now imagine talking to your high school guidance counselor saying that you want to become a designer of integrated life support systems for spaceship Earth. you know and the guy sort of, well, sanitary engineering sounds like what you're interested in, like maybe we can get you designing sewers. So that was how you, but I clearly enjoyed design, architecture. By the age of 10, I was looking at really important books about the development of modern architecture, the Bauhaus, international style, Frank Lloyd Wright. And yeah, somewhere along the way, like I wanted to be that. And I ended up going to MIT and doing a degree in architecture. I specifically asked Buckminster Fuller when I was like 16 or 17, like if he thought that I should go to places like the University of Colorado at Boulder that were beginning these like nascent, environmental design programs, or Goddard, which was a private college that had environmental sustainability, stuff, and I'm not even, I hope Goddard still exists. I mean, and I said, and the choice was that kind of thing where the hippies are hanging out, or should I go to MIT and, do hard math and science and all of that? he wasted no time in telling me that, like, absolutely go to MIT. Back in those days, part of the Bible that I carried around that was inspiration was something called the Whole Earth Catalog. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, or if
I
your
don't.
readers don't know what I'm talking about, please do look it up. Stuart Brand was a Buckminster Fuller acolyte and the editor of the Whole Earth Catalog, which proposed sort of again, before there was an internet, before there were laptop computers, um, before you could buy stuff on your phone. Basically, it was a single resource for sustainable living on the planet. All of a sudden, yeah, that was what I wanted to do. I reached out to Jay Baldwin, who was their editor they didn't call it, nomadics was one thing, but then they also, I forgot exactly what they called sustainability or renewable energy or zero carbon living, what the exact term was. But asked for his advice, which also was go to MIT and learn the hard stuff, which was really not what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear that there was an easier path. So, I did undergraduate and graduate degrees at MIT. I suffered through freshman calculus and physics at MIT, which is, let me just say, one of the goals of that freshman year is to get MIT students to understand that you can start either with Green's and Stokes theorem in calculus and the div, grad, and curl functions and derive Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism that basically govern all of what electricity and magnetism do. Or you can go in the other direction, starting with Maxwell's equations in the physics, and you should be able to derive the calculus that basically helps you understand that. I never achieved that kind of level of proficiency, and in that sense, I suppose maybe there was a fraud perpetrated on the Institute. But they gave me my undergraduate architecture degree and the privilege to go on to a graduate degree, which also included, in between, I had a fellowship in Israel for a year studying solar architecture. I had 5 months studying in Italy, where I learned sort of the real root of what cities were all about. And then I returned to my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, 1980, as a 20-something kid who first worked at my planning commission, doing neighborhood plans, doing a new plan for downtown Louisville that gave me a sense of decision making at the larger scale. It gave me an understanding of public permitting processes and entitlements and the time frame, sometimes ridiculous, involved to go through that, and also the importance of having a public process and learning to communicate well in that process. And somewhere along the line also was an interest in real estate. There was a graduate level class at MIT where an urban land developer would fly up from New York City on the shuttle and teach these wide-eyed architects about the time value of money and cash flows and discounting cash flows for net present value, and how that basically governed what got built in the world that we live in. And I'll just say, all that sifted and settled, but was all present from my earliest years working in architecture. And I began to design some low income housing projects, some interesting urban infill or new construction in a old Victorian neighborhood of old Louisville would get, 12 units would get infilled between some wonderful Victorian structures, and people would go by and say, oh, it fits the neighborhood perfectly. Oh, okay, we can develop that skill set. And then the nonprofit housing partnership locally sort of came to me and said, okay, you show you can design this stuff. You should also think about developing this stuff. And we're here as consultants to help you do that. And my first low income housing project was an eightplex that was infill in a part of old Louisville where I'm sure if I had checked the crime records, I could find out how many murders and bad drug deals had happened in the area. And I hired the right sized contractor. I did the plans. I was the developer. A bank was basically looking not at my balance sheet, but the value of the real estate ultimately to back up what was going on. Because this was low income housing and they get some a Community Reinvestment Act credit, they're all in. And I hire an outside contractor. And even though I'd done a pretty good set of plans, and it was only, 2 by 6, it was probably 2 by 6, 24-inch on center construction. Maybe it was 16 on center, slab on grade, easy. But like, I found myself spending so much time on the job site answering the contractor's questions that, like, or, what to do now given that they had screwed up, like, oh, yeah, this wall got laid out crooked. Okay, what do you want us to do? And sometimes it was tear it out and start all over again. And part of the inspiration, so about midway through the construction, I clearly realized that I could screw up on a job site just as well as these guys could screw up. And, I could actually get paid to screw up if I were the contractor. So, in my next project, which was a 12-plex that was infill within that neighborhood, I was the builder as well. I had a very good and experienced superintendent working for me on that project, and he had been working for the other company that built the 8-plex. And his first day of meeting me, as I come up on the job site and I'm seeing everybody scurrying around and he's barking orders at people, was he paused for a moment. He took my hand, he shook my hand and he said, "Hey, Mark, nice to meet you. My name's Lauren. Every job site needs an asshole, and I'm it." And he was that kind of ramrod superintendent, that basically subscribed to are there children that watch this
You can say
podcast?
whatever
Can I
you
speak
want.
freely? Okay. So he sort of lived by an ethos of, and I think this is a direct quote, that if you hadn't motherfuckered somebody by 8:30 in the morning, you weren't off to a good start. And over the years, because there was a group of subs that stayed with us and us with them, the early morning greetings were a sign of endearment and of community. And so, of inclusiveness and belonging, we could almost say today. And then that 12-plex was like, in the world of like, it almost got stopped before it ever started. One day I'm at the office and I get a phone call. A guy has fallen off the roof. And I think 3 stories. He landed on some rebar that did not have an orange cap on it. The rebar went through and through. Somebody was smart enough to yeah, imagine this. And I'm 20 something, maybe I'm 30 something at the time, right? And personally guaranteeing, everything, I'm sure. And the rebar had gone through and through, sticking out one end, and somebody had the presence of mind to either get a torch or I don't know, and cut the rebar off. And the guy got transported to the hospital, got patched up and fixed. And fortunately, lived and everything was all right. So if that's not enough to sort of like almost keep you from ever starting, I mean, did we believe in fall protection? Yes. Did we talk about job site safety? Yes. And yet you see something like that happen early on. Horrible, horrible situation. Unfortunately, the guy pretty much ended up coming back to the job site,
Wow.
I mean, it just hit in all the right places. I don't know how. No internal damage of any note that I ever heard of. But then there was apparently some kind of dispute between the framing subcontractor and one of their hires, and somebody wasn't getting paid or something. It had nothing to do with us. We were paying everything like clockwork and just fine. And I get a call I'm trying to remember whether it was midnight or 2 in the morning, as structure was also being done with SIPs. So this is 1980s. This is probably one of the, early buildings done with SIPS panels, structural insulated panels, polystyrene foam core, OSB skins. Fisher SIPS was the local company that supplied them, and we were going to do this super energy efficient building. But I get the call in the early hours of the morning or late at night that the building's on fire and it apparently burns to the ground. And the arson squad suspected that there was something in a dispute between, you know, right? That somebody basically set the building afire so that I would end up, or we would end up collecting the insurance money, hopefully, in order to rebuild it from scratch. Fortunately, I had banks who understood that, we had to rebuild. But, I learned that the fire was so hot that there was some surface spalling on the concrete slab, so there was, so we had to get into some, what for the 1980s was high tech bonding and slab repair, and leveling out with, new compounds, So, let me just say, this was the kind of introduction to construction that would, that, first of all, anybody who gets into construction nor needs to understand that, like, hopefully nothing exactly like either one of those things will ever happen to you. But if you talk to enough people who've been in construction, they all have their own version of that story, right?
Yep.
I mean, it it is, it's a field that's wrought with those problems, finish.
Yeah, I'd love to chime in here because I'm just noticing a theme that I already want to sidetrack a little bit on. But I want to get into Wonder Window and the latest stuff you're doing as well. But quickly, just the theme I'm noticing is you're here as a 10-year-old actually kind of starting to think about how can we make sustainable living more affordable and energy efficient, and just about at every corner there's resistance almost from the universe, it feels like. And I've noticed this in my career as well. Just starting, I wanted to be an architect too. I looked up to Frank Lloyd Wright and a lot of those same individuals that made me get excited about architecture, but just feels like I've also been beaten down into, no, this industry is too hard to do logical stuff that makes sense for humankind, that will make life better for everyone. Stop thinking so big, just build the building. And that's sad to me. I studied a lot. I don't know too, maybe, I don't know if this is another sidetrack, but in college I got excited about LEED certification, and I've kind of since been a little disappointed at the implementation, or I don't know what it is about LEED that disappoints me exactly, but I'm just sad that it isn't easier, like you've been preaching since you were 10 years old, to make sustainable living that's energy efficient. Just even like I got excited about your presentation at ENR Future Tech because I was just like, window details, waterproofing, like we can make this stuff better at small micro levels that will actually, and then you just encounter all this resistance. I wonder if you resonate with that or want to chime in on any of that.
Jimmy Cliff's song, they're putting up resistance, right? And I'm not remembering his answer back. There's so much you've just tapped into that I want to respond to, and the easiest place for me to jump in will be about LEED. And it so happens I'm an applicant right now to the U.S. Green Building Council's California chapter to be a member of their Net Zero Accelerator. I think I've developed essentially new DNA for affordable net zero energy wood frame buildings with low embodied carbon and wildfire fire resistance, which is important, of course, in California. And we'll get into the details of that later. So, and I certainly don't want to say anything to insult the USGBC universe. They were Rick Fedrizzi, who is, I think, the founder of USGBC, was the guy who gave me my award in 2005. There's a little history I skipped over from doing that 12-plex in whatever 1994 or whatever it was. into 2005 or so, well, by 2008, won the National Association of Home Builders Green Multifamily Building of the Year Award for an infill construction, a building east of downtown Louisville in an area today that thrives called Nulu. It's the hip, cool, urban place to be in Louisville. And I was maybe 10 years too early. Um, ended up getting caught in the Great Recession, and we'll get into that later too. But we had developed this building that we got an award from the National Association of Home Builders for the Green Multifamily Building of the Year Award. And it wasn't happening out in Berkeley, California. It was 2008, and it was happening in Louisville, Kentucky. Who ever heard of such a thing, right? So you know, so that brings me to LEED. At the time I was doing that 84,000 square foot building that was calculating out at $100 per unit per year for energy. It might have been, it might have ended up being $300 energy per year, with plug loads and appliances. But still, uh, pretty incredible for its day. And even still, um, and at that time, I had clearly recognized that LEED was leading us astray. I have been not a public campaigner about this. I haven't rolled up my shirt sleeves and become a member of the Green Building Council in order to try to politic for the position. I'm too busy doing what I'm doing, which, it's like, and that need to stay focused is for someone like me who can be easily distracted by every issue that goes on, is super important. But in 2005, when the Kyoto Protocols came out addressing climate change, when, I will say the IPCC's most dire predictions about what the future could hold in terms of climate change and temperature rise and the catastrophe that we might be courting. At that very moment, it became clear to me that we needed net zero now. We didn't need the incrementalism of LEED that, gives you a point for a bicycle rack and a toilet thing, you can dry your hands without using paper, like because you've got a Dyson, thingy, right? I mean, I can't. And one of the reasons I don't in public be critical of LEED, because I understand there's so many practitioners that got their introduction to sustainability, they got a foundation in it, and it almost makes it okay that they've trained, so many people who have some degree of smarts, but might not understand solar paths and what the implication for the general path of the sun through the sky might be for where you put windows, how much window you put, what the R value, what the exterior shading of that is. Um, uh, LEED talks about window to wall ratios. And for those of us that learned passive solar design directly from Ed Masria and Doug Balcom of Los Alamos Labs, like I did in the 1980s, because I also believe in continuing education. I can have degrees from MIT, but I've got to be continuing to pay for education. I'm going to pay for education one way or another throughout my entire life. And you're nodding your head, and any other person who's involved in construction is nodding their head of, oh yeah, like that insurance settlement that got made, was a graduate degree in education about, what to do or what not to do, right? But the driving passion since 2005 has been net zero now, and understanding that LEED was not being aggressive enough in reaching that target, that the net energy use and intensities that were coming out of LEED buildings were still in the 60 BTUs per square foot per year range, which is great. But, if the reality is this current technology can cost effectively bring that to 20 kBTU per square foot per year, or in the current work that I'm doing with net zero energy micro homes, you know, the calculation tools that we're using are the simple, they're not so simple. They're very sophisticated. The CBEX tools, they're a part of California Energy Code compliance. California, fourth largest economy in the world. They've just overtaken Japan. They're at the leading edge of everything that's going on in renewable energy and its adoption, including virtually requiring battery storage in new homes. And we just completed this 672 square foot net zero energy home that I built for my daughter in Chico, California, that according to the CBEX calculations was 11 kBTU per square foot per year. And am happy to report that since November, it's been actually, in terms of the way that my daughter has actually lived in the home, she's been net positive. Not that this is a great amount of net positive energy, but she's to the good of producing 86 kilowatt hours of energy more than she has consumed during that time. And this is on a house where the hard costs of construction were $178,000. Adding in the soft costs brought it up to, I want to say 230. Where's my little 234, something like that. Uh, but that basically were, yeah, 234,000. So that doesn't include the lot cost. And suddenly that experience, just finishing the house in November, taught me that we're at the threshold of affordable net zero now. But what that experience also taught me, because I developed this great wall system, multiple layers. I call it a shaded, ventilated, double radiant barrier rain screen. Hardy panel on the outside, but a full 3/4 inch drainage layer, to the inside. The OSB is waterproofed with a liquid coating. And as I observed the building going together and all these layers, and the number of circumnavigations of a 24 by 28 foot, small little footprint house. But, I had this crew that varied between 3 and 5 pretty good carpenters. Some of them were good carpenters. Some of them were just good helpers. But, as we went around the building multiple times for each of these layers, and and the mismatch between 8 foot sheet goods and 9 foot ceilings requiring 2 rows of blocking that were going to be thermally bridging through the wall. And you realize this is not smart. Like, I poured my heart into being as smart as I could on this, and now I've got to rethink everything all over again. I'm at age 69. I didn't honestly have this conversation with myself, but I could have said, at age 69, you've been a total failure. You know, I give myself the reward of, oh, it is a net zero energy home. It only costs 234,000. Is net positive, excuse me, not even net zero. Okay, those are things to be celebrated, so that I'm fond of saying I'm not as dumb as I look.
You're a success by the measure of moving from failure to failure with no lack of enthusiasm is the definition of success. You're a very successful person because you've learned a lot of hard lessons, right?
I think you have just shown a level of wisdom that is for the ages and is ageless. The process of getting stuff permitted. Uh, there's so many obstacles that you can face. And and fortunately, someone at the Louisville Chamber of Commerce in a speech had found a photograph that I have not been able to find on the internet of Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison sitting in a chair, and off to the side of him is a pile of light bulbs that didn't work. And, the story I've heard the versions of the story where he had to try 756 versions before he found one that worked. But I've also heard versions of the story that he actually had to try more like 11,000 versions before he found one that would work. And I'm fond of, as I would be prototyping, Windows with an eye towards developing R7 and R9 Windows that were cheaper or as cheap as today's Windows. And I'm on the verge of doing that. There would be days I would come back from failure and I would say to my wife, well, Mrs. Edison, it didn't work again. And fortunately, we have both maintained a sense of humor in the face of failure. I can also speak to the fact that we have both found a way to stay together after having worked together in that real estate development, construction, and sales company. And that sense of being indefatigable, of viewing obstacles as just things that are in the path that you're going to get around them. It's just a matter of how long is it going to take. And that if you can't get around them, or you're going to go over them, and if you can't get over them, you're going to go under them. I mean, it's not a matter of not taking no for an answer. Certainly reasonableness has to invade the discussion, at some point. Yes, there have been innumerable pivots, from this to that. I could have, after completing my daughter's home and understanding that we had been successful, I could have left it there, but there was something that said we can do better. And in the idiocy of just sort of playing around with what I thought were construction hacks, I figured out, for instance, a way to get 8-inch deep R30 walls using cellulose insulation, which is fire resistant, termite proof, and as low an embodied energy product as you can get, um, into a 2x4, 24-inch on center wall without using tons of extra framing. I'm going to build the first 120 square foot micro home, hopefully one here in Mississippi, working with the University of Southern Mississippi on a program where, they called me up maybe a year and a half ago, and they said, can we write you into a grant we're preparing? We have no idea. Yeah, yeah, sure. Write me in. I had totally forgotten about it. They called me up and said, we forgot to tell you, we got this grant and we need to talk about, so fortunately my work has progressed where they might be the source of launching my business into revenue. The other thing that, yeah, which gets me to another point, revenue focus, getting to revenue for a new startup is really important. I've only been able to, I'll say, artificially avoid that because, Social Security at this point is allowing me to, put food on the table, and I have a roof over my house, over my head. Um, but Yeah, an innovator, after taking the risks of real estate and construction, an innovator's risks in getting to revenue is one of those things that seems perfectly reasonable after dealing with all of the foibles of construction.
Yeah, I want to say that I just marked that down. I got to save up. I'm thinking about 250K because I'm in a little bit more expensive. Well, actually, Chico might be similar to where I'm at, but two things. I want that house on my property someday. And I mean, think about that. You can have a house built and I bet she loves living in it too, beside the fact that she's contributing to a better environment. I bet it's beautiful. I'd love to go visit too. Maybe we can do a part two where I get to walk people through this home. I think that would be awesome. But can we get
And
into,
and
yeah,
well, yeah, she would love that. She's a landscaper in Chico, and what I love is that yeah, my imprint is pretty heavy on the bones of the building, but it's her home and she's made it her home. And I haven't actually seen it in the flesh since she's made it her home, but I get photos of holiday celebrations and things like that are very heartwarming. First of all, every parent should be able to see their child enjoy that. And the reality of the world that we're in is that even, I'll say, formerly well to do folks like my wife and myself, are living with the reality that children, like my daughter and, and more of your colleagues, particularly in a place like California, find it impossible to afford a home. And if we don't do something about that as Americans, if we don't maintain the American dream with some degree of access and affordability, and a way to provide a chain up,
Hmm.
in as one's household grows and one's household income might grow through a career, I firmly believe our democracy and our republic is in serious jeopardy. During the Clinton years, home ownership in this country was available to close to two-thirds of the population. Maybe it was 62%. And there was a strong desire to raise that to 67% and keep going. The ultimate fallout from that was, in some in some people's minds, is that we ended up with a Great Recession. You could qualify for that mortgage if you could fog a mirror. Um, uh, so somewhere, and actually let me backtrack long enough to say very clearly the financial crisis of 2008 was caused more by the actions of bankers, bundling up these not so quality loans and selling them off as mortgage-backed securities. Let us not lose sight of the fact that the real villain in the process is this, overwhelming desire for profit that ends up, in a very strange way, subverting the other goals that I think we have as a society. And I don't want to indict capitalism completely because I'm a full participant and a beneficiary. Um, I'm certainly not suggesting socialism is the ultimate answer. We need intelligent solutions that serve us today. And I'll get off my highfalutin stuff there.
I think you're totally right. We need a balance of both sides. But I wanted to dig in on, is affordability and sustainability at odds? Like, it sounds like they're not from your perspective. And I really want to dig into that because that's exciting news.
The premise of the clean energy transition for so many years. So first of all, I remember when when solar cells were things only made for satellites, and they cost $2,000 a watt, or uh 200, $200 a watt, even by the time the space race was done. And here we are, and then I remember the years of the 90s moving into the 2000s, when the price of photovoltaics was probably about $20 a watt. And I had this continuous conversation with fraternity brothers about how we were only within an order of magnitude of reducing the cost per watt. And now suddenly here we are. I'm living in a net zero energy house here in Mississippi, actually net positive also on the year. We have 20 solar panels on the roof, 7.1 or 7.3 kilowatts of solar, no battery, and we're net zero here. That at the time ended up netting out as a $20,000 investment. Maybe it was even closer to 15 after the tax credits that were available. And yet, I understand, that set of choices isn't available to everybody. Not everybody has an extra, there Costco, Sunrun, there's some amazing sources for getting, good quality solar installations. I'll give a shout out to Solar Alternatives out of New Orleans that did our installation. complete pros. And but here we are at $2 a watt for solar, and so we now have national policies that are getting ready to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. That somehow net zero has become so politicized. How that happened, I just don't understand. Where the idea that solar and wind even might have a contribution to the nation's energy security doesn't register with with some Americans. Um, but anybody that I know who's like myself that has solar on their house, who drives a plug-in Prius, where almost all my driving around town driving is done on sunbeams.
Mhm.
And I describe this as the highest form of self-actualization that a human being can achieve. You can be driving in traffic and you know that you're actually in sync with the universe. You're actually, doing some of the lifting that needs to be done. So that brings me, are we at the threshold? I haven't comprehensively proven it by having you the built example that I can show. But you're talking to me what I presented at ENR, and it was great that I had that speaking gig lined up, is because it gave me the focus and determination to look at my windows and understand that, okay, I figured out how to produce R7 and R9 windows, but have I figured out how to produce them affordably? And by rethinking all of that, I've come up with this little kind of construction. This is an acrylic. It could be polycarbonate on the outside if you wanted that protection, but it comes already sealed in this whole little wrap package. And you put two of these back to back in a framed opening, and you've got an R7 window where a 2 foot by 4 foot window can cost $290, and suddenly you're almost at the same kind of cost as a $225 utility R3.3 low E argon window, PVC frame. Yes, it doesn't open. It doesn't open by design. I think if we're going to make housing affordable, we have to look at solutions that really contribute to that affordability. And obviously, one does not want to compromise health, safety, or welfare. Egress and ventilation requirements need to be met. And in the designs that you'll see me do, that's what doors and sliding screen doors and magnetic screens are for. Let's have great ventilation. Let's have emergency egress. But, the idea that windows should perform all of those functions is an example, perhaps, that integrating uses in a single product sometimes has its drawbacks. I heard from somebody at the ENR conference that there is a Michigan firm that's doing vacuum insulated glass, and with vacuum insulated glass you can get 14 windows that are just 2 panes thick, and they can fit traditional PVC frames. And technologically it's a really great thing. I've also heard from researchers that have been working on this for 20 years that tell me that because of the warranty, because of the cost issues, they're not sure this is ever really going to become widespread. The guy I talked to at the conference made me think that he was of the mind that this Michigan group was going to bring vacuum insulated glass to being able to sell a unit for $25 a square foot. And indeed, they may be doing that, and that's great. The last thing I heard before some of the big players in glass got out of making vacuum insulated glass windows is that the costs were $90 a square foot, and they were going up to 120, or more. The premise, so we got solar down to $2 a watt, but then the premise of sort of what the California Energy Code sort of is, yeah, we're going to make builders spend more money on higher levels of insulation that right now, according to current techniques, cost more. We're going to make generally builders spend money on a heat pump hot water heater where like we have the entry level unit, I think was $2,000 before installation costs. and you can buy $5,000 heat pump hot water heaters at your local Home Depot or Lowe's. We have a fabulous induction stove, but they're, costing 15, $1,300 for an entry level model. Maybe we got something cheaper. I don't know. And, the federal government up to now has sort of been acting in this carrot and stick kind of
Mhm.
world where we're going to ramp up the code requirements, but we're also going to make an energy efficient home credit available for builders of homes at this level, which is a $5,000 credit in addition to the 30% or so solar tax credit. What I've essentially done is to work within that carrot and stick world, but try to find the line where innovation can make the 2x4 24-inch on center wall, that because it gets rid of all the extra framing of 16-inch on center framing, it gets rid of OSB, which is, let me just say, having been on sites with OSB sheathing for a lot of years, it's sort of like as a necessary evil on a
Yeah.
job site. It naturally, it's a low embodied energy material. It's a composite that makes use of waste, in some ways. All of those are positives. It has great racking strength, but, you know, for something the size of a ADU, can you get equivalent racking strength out of the fiber cement paneling? And I've written grant proposals that will give me the money to actually do the official ASTM 72 racking resistance tests of wall sections with third-party testing groups like Intertech. And I'm waiting on seeing if that funding gets approved. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and build the 120 square foot shed that doesn't require a building permit, that is so small that the seismic forces that are developed, even in California, can't be too crazy that, there's not an effective way to. And so suddenly you start to see that there's a lot of things that can be eliminated. The average person that's on a construction site that's got to follow a manufacturer's instructions and specs and the architects this and that and da da da, you know there's not room for that experimentation.
Mm.
At 120 square feet or less, we can experiment without having disastrous results for human health, safety, and welfare. As someone who still is a registered architect in the state of Kentucky, at least, I'm going to do my best to make sure that every code thing that I know about is upheld. But I'm not going to then, but I might use a material for something that's a little beyond the manufacturer's thoughts, because they can't cover every possible use. And at the level of something that's 120 square feet, where the total material cost I've calculated is $25,000 to build, if DIY, if you're doing it yourself. And even if you hired an outside contractor, I can't imagine you're ever going to spend more than $50,000. And you're going to have 120 square feet of a room that actually is net zero energy. 2 kilowatts of solar on the roof, a 5 kilowatt hour battery. And there are companies that make solar products that are oriented more towards, I'll say, the camping and recreational vehicle market and the outdoors market, where it's all plug and play. You don't have, it's not a, it's the opportunity to not to be, you don't have to be grid connected. You can, you don't have to go through electrical permits. You're doing something that is, a few solar panels on the roof and a 5 kilowatt battery that it all plugs into. And for something as small as 120 square feet, you've got all the plugs right where you need them, right in front of you.
I
Um,
think it's the perfect opportunity to prototype too, like you're saying, because you can do these kind of repeatably and you can iterate and get better over time, keeping them small. It makes sense to me from a prototyping standpoint.
uh, Anybody who's been involved in innovation and manufacture understands the concept of rapid prototyping. And, the idea of doing it in micro homes, particularly with an orientation of serving the homeless, serving for disaster relief. We just lost 18,000 homes, I think, in LA. I don't know that the micro homes are going to be replacements for those $1 million plus homes, right? I'm not proposing that. But where are the construction workers going to live while they're rebuilding? Where are, some of these people that have inevitably the world is going to work where people are underinsured in the face of these natural disasters. And, you know, we've developed designs that show that you could have two or three of these no permit required micro homes in your backyard, at 120 square feet or less, according to IRC and CR, California's residential code. If it's a shed, you don't require a building permit. Um, the total cost of permits and fees and the related engineering to getting those permits and fees for my daughter's house was somewhere between $22,000. And if we want to know why housing is so expensive and what's making it impossible for people to be able to afford a house, yeah, those are some important things to look at. And in the meantime, the law provides an easy way around that at 120 square feet at a time. So I hope within the year to be coming back on your program and having videos to show of what we've done in Mississippi. And I hope by then, even in California, and to show that, yeah, you can do net zero for, $50,000, or less. Someone somewhere being a good economist is going to figure out, yeah, but you could take the solar panels off the roof, and just and yeah, you could take out, oh yeah, you don't have to have 8 inches of cellulose insulation. You could have less, and you could save some money. There's and all of that's true. And I've worked with part of my education as an architect, and I think every architect and builder does need to go through this, must understand it. Architecture schools in particular, I don't think construction technology schools, but architecture schools preach this notion that, the architect is an agent of social change. And the exuberance of people like Frank Lloyd Wright on the one hand, or Le Corbusier, and their unwillingness to compromise their designs. Or, when Frank Lloyd Wright got the call that from Mr. Kaufman that it was leaking inside falling water, and he complained that I think that it was leaking on his head. Frank Lloyd Wright didn't waste any time in saying, "Well, move your chair." No, that's not a good answer, right? Yes, we need to build buildings that don't have leaks, and yes, that is a challenge, and it's not always under our personal direct control, no matter how much we try to control it. But assuming that you can take care of, that basic notion of firmness and fitness for use, you know, what I hope we're quickly going to prove is that for, you know, reasonable budgets that begin to resemble the budgets of other conventional buildings, or less money, we can build net zero energy housing now. And so if in 2005 my new motto was net zero energy now, I've added one more word to that in 2025, which is affordable net zero.
Mm.
And so anybody who's listening that wants to build a a a a, a, a micro home, whether it's 120 square feet and doesn't require a permit, or whether it's 288 square feet or 574 square feet or 864 square feet, and does require a permit by laying things out on 24 inches on center, by understanding that, and this was a learning curve for me coming to California. I've practiced in the eastern United States. I understand the spans for southern yellow pine. It was used to 24 inches on center. I'm doing this off the top of my head, but a 2 by 10 could span with residential loads 15 feet and 6 inches or something like that. When you get into Doug fir out there in California, it's like you better start learning that the spans shorten up. And so suddenly you're looking at, I mean, what I think I've determined is that the sweet spot in terms of economics, in terms of housing layout, is essentially 12 feet of width between party walls. We have designed 12-foot bays in flats, back flats. We've designed 12-foot bays um, uh, in my daughter's house in Chico. Basically, we've got two of them that are 28 feet long, and you're automatically from the beginning building in 24-inch on center floor and ceiling framing and wall framing. And because my windows are fitting between 24-inch on center windows, we don't have jack studs, cripples, headers get eliminated. And suddenly you go from walls where framing occupies 22 or 25% of the wall area. And anybody who does wood framing should just spend time looking at their job sites and, doing these nerdy little calculations that I do. I've forgotten most all of my calculus, but I can still do nerdy little calculations that tell me, okay, what I'm looking at, when I calculate the area of that total wall, there's 22% of that wall area that's made up with framing that basically only, if it's a 2 by 4, maybe is an R5, and it's, radiating heat and cool to the inside. We now have, our codes have reacted and required continuous insulation. And unfortunately, what that represents for some is the addition of foam plastics for that insulation. Horrible idea. And in the Chico home, what we did is we just cut off foam strips and we applied them to the studs only, so we could use 8 boards of foam instead of using 32 boards of foam or whatever it would have been. But with my most recent innovation, I've gotten rid of the foam altogether. That I've got a hardware offset, which puts the inner wall 4 or 4.5 inches to the inside. Some people will say, "Oh, yeah, but you've destroyed, livable floor area." Yeah, I think this is a trade-off you have to make if you're going to have uh, R30 walls and you're going to do it in a low embodied energy way. We can we can wait until vacuum insulating panels that are 2 inches thick are available, um, or we can recognize that nature abhors a vacuum, and such things, even when they are commercially available, will likely be very expensive and involve some kind of warranty issue. Okay, maybe we instead want to keep things simple and develop the formula for like what works every time to build it for low dollar or affordable dollar. Let me put it that way. And, you know, I'm anxious to build that first 120 square feet that's going to show us how. Um, so that's the way of looking at this, as being, how do we afford it today? And make it happen today. And I think there probably is a sphere of elitism in the high atmosphere of architects who love to talk about the way life should be
Mhm.
versus, and so somehow we just have to, we'll write it into the code and we'll make people afford it. Engineers contribute to that. Builders also contribute to that. And, versus an attitude which says, yeah, but if we pay close attention to building science, to building physics, to all those things that are fundamental in terms of function. And can we figure out a way to do it cheaper that just works?
Hmm.
And that's what, at age 69, I'm still excited about the prospects for that. And I think we're going to be able to show it pretty convincingly sometime within the next year.
It's been awesome to listen. I could listen to you for hours talk about this stuff because to me you just strike me as like if any of us have gone to doctors recently, it's like you have an issue with your elbow, you go to an elbow doctor and he says, "Well, that's actually a skin problem. You need to go to a dermatologist." And then you get put through all these different specialists. I feel like construction is a little bit like that, where there's a lot of people in silos that are super expert about a very particular thing. And I'm interested in talking to people like you that are looking at this thing from a holistic level. And you're trying to not just make buildings better, but make them more affordable, make it so that everybody can have a net zero home. I mean, this is something we do have to look at so many different angles to get there. I'm glad people like you are looking at it. I am going to keep checking in with you and I hope to do many follow-ups on this possibly, and don't give up. That's I'm asking you, stay in this thing with me because we need people like you.
Edison, very part of what I didn't say, Edison very famously said, most people give up, most inventors give up when they are just right on the threshold of success. And I have found myself so many times in that situation where I think that if only this grant comes in, if only I do this test, if only I fab this thing, am I now going to have the next? And for one reason or another, it doesn't happen, but only because I keep progressing, only because I'm never satisfied, only because I notice that there's two runs of blocking in that wall. What are those runs of blocking doing there? Why do we need that? You know, does it make me then like I'm not gonna be so impatient with myself that I can't live with myself. What I do honestly do sleeping on things and the problem solving that I creatively I will often do in my sleep becomes, as well as in my waking hours, becomes the thing that like suddenly there's that eureka moment in prototyping this wall idea. It was like I drilled a Simpson screw in a certain way through a thing with a thing, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, it really works. And I could think about it in my head forever. But until I did that construction step of saying, well, okay, let's try something. Let's see if it works. All of us, imp, you know, and it's like easy. That is the working method, and that is the thing that propels me on. And it certainly has been a gas talking with you and sharing that whole
Appreciate
approach.
it. Yeah,
If
I'm
if
gonna
if
go
if
ahead.
folks want to reach me, the easiest thing to do is to hit me at Mark with a K at wonderwindow.net. I am enough of a dinosaur that I like my email, and at least gives me a record of who I'm talking to. As I do when I walk on a construction site and also when I sail, I tell my crew, I've learned to say, if I ever start yelling and if I ever start acting like a, then you've got a right to come back to me and correct me and to suggest that I do otherwise. Construction sites, I think in general, are places where um, people who didn't get treated right at home take it out on other people who woke up on the wrong side of the bed for whatever reason, or facing challenges in other aspects of their life, end up taking it out on other people in the construction process. And we need to learn to care for each other a little bit better
Mhm.
than just saying, yeah, let's go drink.
Amen to that.
But that's not the right solution. Okay. I've wandered far afield, but I hope everybody has a healthy time reaching net zero energy in their lives.
Well, I've really benefited and enjoyed it. Thanks for doing this. I'll put some stuff in the show notes too so people can remember how to reach you. And thanks everybody for joining.
Okay. Thanks so much.